How is it in 2016 that an established watch brand that has an integrated steel sports watch designed or with design lineage directly to Gerald Genta looks at that and says, you know what, I'm gonna kill the Genta design. I don't want that in my collection anymore. Hi everyone and welcome to Shaluso, and yes, today we are going to be talking about the IWC Ingenieur, specifically looking at how IWC somehow brought itself to kill off the Genta design Ingenieur and stuck with what we have currently, which yes, traces its history back to 1955, but is perhaps a bit less distinct, shall we say, and less market appropriate. Well, to do that, first we need to look at the history of the Ingenieur line itself. So in 1955, it was introduced as a watch designed for engineers, as the name suggests. It was anti-magnetic, something of a comparator to the Milgauss. I'm not sure if the Milgauss came out before or after, maybe let me know in the comments, but they definitely were released around the same time, targeting the same sort of audience. Then in 1976, the same year that the Nautilus was released, Gerald Genta completely revamped the Ingenieur, put his signature style on it, with the integrated bracelet, a more jewelry-like appearance, a stylized bezel, in this case with 5 sort of indentations all across it. In many ways, it's sort of a mix of the rounded style of the Nautilus and the more angular style of the Royal Oak. It sort of softens up the Royal Oak a little bit, but it's not maybe as round and flowy and organic as something like the Nautilus. So it's a nice in-between of his two icons, and it's often mentioned in the same conversation when people name some of Gerald Genta's greatest designs. Now that style that was introduced in 1976 essentially was retained all the way up until 2016, with the major upgrade coming in 2005 with the IW3227, which used the in-house movement and its derivatives, which were all using that similar design but just a little bit bigger, a bit more appropriate for the early 2000s moving into the 2010s. And one example of that is the dual time, which I have on the screen right now. However, then in 2008, IWC, alongside the Genta Ingenieur, also introduced what they called the vintage 1955 Ingenieur. As seen on your screen in its Laureus format with a beautiful blue dial limited to 1,000 pieces, this echoed the original design of the 1955 Ingenieur. So much more pared down, much simpler, much more classic design, a lot more formal. However, both of these watches retained their anti-magnetic properties and 120 meters of water resistance. So they were still very much proper sports watches. However, one leaned much more heavily into its role as a sports watch, meanwhile the other was leaning much more into, I guess, a dress watch aesthetic while still having the pretensions of a sports watch. And the two of these were sold side by side for quite a few years until 2016, when IWC decided to kill off the Genta Ingenieur and rename the vintage 1955 collection as just the Ingenieur, as well as scaling it down to 40 millimeters, putting in a Sellita SW300 in it, and pushing it down market in terms of IWC's hierarchy. So if we're going to look at how IWC got to this point of that decision, we definitely have to look at these two side to side. But thanks to today's sponsor, we can't. Chronext has over 7,000 watches in their inventory, including an example of both the Genta Ingenieur as well as the vintage 1955. So I was able to put both of these together. And the cool thing about Chronext is that if you want to also compare two versions of the same watch, whether it be two generations, two different sizes, you can actually order them to be delivered to any of their boutiques across Europe, and you can actually try them on, look at them, see how they look next to each other, and take your decision then and there on which one you want to take home with you. And you can even get a discount on your purchase if you buy it online first and use the discount code SHALUSO on the checkout. So you'll find links in the description below to check out Chronext. They have new, pre-owned, vintage, and all of them with a 24-month warranty, so there's definitely something for everyone. So now we have the two watches side by side, let's take a look at some of the redeeming characteristics of both. Starting with the Genta one, so here we have the dual time variant. It's a 43 millimeter, however, once you put it on the wrist, it sort of hides that 43, despite sitting on its own looking much chunkier. The bracelet just kind of drapes itself around your wrist and the watch hides its size even though it's a little bit bigger. And if you do have a smaller wrist, they did also do versions of this in a 40mm. They have chronographs, they have in-house movements, they have outsourced movements. There's a Genta Ingenieur for pretty much everyone. This particular one actually has a movement that I think really highlights something that IWC does really well, which is doing proper modifications to outsource movements. So we're not talking about just, putting your logo on the rotor. In this, they actually modified the 2893 to have a jumping hour hand instead of jumping 24-hour hand, making it what's known as a true GMT or a traveler's GMT. If you want to know the difference between a true GMT and what's known as a collar GMT, there's actually a video up in the corner in which I explain the two different types. Getting back to this though, they took the initiative to make that modification. Nearly every other user of the ETA 2893 just leaves it as is. Quick set, and with a changing 24-hour hand, they leave the hour hand as is. But this is just the start of IWC's over-engineering on this watch. If you look at the bracelet, as long as you have a toothpick, you can actually take apart this entire bracelet. You don't need any screws or anything like that. It's simply just a toothpick to press in those buttons and then everything comes apart. And the last clue to how over-engineered this watch is that when you open up the bracelet, you see this beautiful perlage all through the swing arms. This is an area that nearly no one decorates. Usually it's just a matte finish, maybe it's polished. But this sort of finishing, it just adds a little bit of extra specialness in an area that, will probably never be seen or paid attention to, but they did it anyway. And that's the case with this entire watch. The finishing is great. There's so much depth to the dial. It's something that is almost like a work of art. You can just look at it and there's always something going on. By comparison, we have the vintage 1955. Now, admittedly, this is probably the 1955 in its best iteration. It is a little bit different to what's currently available as the present day Ingenieur, but the design language is the same. And this also does show it in its best light. It has the in-house movement, it has the blue dial because it is the limited edition Laureus, but the overall design is very similar to what we have today. And yes, very quickly you can see that it comes off as being much more elegant, much classier. Interestingly, this particular one with the in-house movement is actually nearly the same size as that dual time. So it's a 42.5mm versus a 43, but this one definitely hides its size even more, and that's down to that just sleeker design, more classical proportions compared to the extra details that you have on the Genta version. But the important thing to remember is that this still has the same anti-magnetic properties as the other one, as well as still having similar water resistance. So this is still very much a sports watch. Now, as to why they would have picked this, well, there's a couple reasons. If you look at the times, watch sizes were trending down, and even though the Genta one did wear smaller, there were even 40mm ones available, it still looked like a big watch. So I think maybe they thought they were moving with the times, and I think maybe they thought that because sizes were trending smaller, they also made the calculation that perhaps people were going more for dress watches. That didn't really pan out for them. And the last little hint as to why they would want to do that is because they were also trying to elevate another model, which is the big pilot or the pilot's watch collection. So much so that they actually stopped using the Ingenieur as the watch of choice for their Formula One sponsorship with Mercedes. Instead, you started seeing pilots and big pilots on the wrists of Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas, instead of the Genta-inspired Ingenieurs that you would see featured with Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton, as well as their general collaboration with Mercedes-AMG, which ironically was what kicked off the update in 2005. So it's interesting seeing how their sponsorship ties into where they positioned this watch and what they ended up doing with it in the future. So that, I think, is the main reason. I think more than anything, they wanted to sort of spread out their collection a little bit more, push the Ingenieur a little bit more down market so they could then elevate the pilot. But let me know in the comments below, what do you think of these two different Ingenieur styles? Do you think it makes sense to kill off the 55 inspired one and bring back the Genta one? Should they sell them both next to each other again? Let me know what you think IWC should do with the Ingenieur, and were they right to do what they did at the time? Was it a good move, bad move? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, if you like this video, make sure you like it and share it. If you want to see more pictures and infographics of watches, make sure you follow me on Instagram at Shaluso. If you want to see more videos of watches, then make sure you subscribe to the channel as well. And of course, a big thanks to Chronext for providing me with both of these watches to film. Make sure you check out the links in the description below, as well as use the discount code SHALUSO if you find anything you want to buy. And of course, thanks for watching this video, and we'll catch you on the next one.